The Galactic Council chamber was silent, a tense stillness hanging in the air. Around the grand, circular table sat representatives from every corner of the galaxy, beings of power, intelligence, and ancient wisdom. They had debated for hours, days even, yet there had been no progress. Their minds were locked in a pattern of endless arguments, their voices clashing like the tides against jagged rocks. But no solution had been found. At the head of the table, Commander Kane Rook stood, his sharp eyes scanning the room. His face was hard, a reflection of the countless battles he had fought and won, both on the battlefield and in the realm of diplomacy. He had seen war up close, too close, but his loyalty had always been to humanity. The United Terran Federation, UTF, had sent him here to do more than just talk. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and they had no time for the endless, fruitless discussions that were playing out in front of him. The pulse, an energy anomaly expanding rapidly, had already consumed entire star systems. It was an existential threat to every species, yet the Council couldn't agree on a course of action. Yaltarn, a towering figure from the Vokari, had been arguing for the last hour that the pulse could be contained with a superweapon. His voice boomed across the chamber. "We must not delay any longer. The pulse will consume us all if we do not act now. The superweapon is our only hope." Commander Rook clenched his fists, the weight of his military experience pulling at him. The Vokari had a history of relying on brute force, something humanity had never agreed with. He had fought against their kind before, and he wasn't about to put his faith in their destructive solution now. But the Council, unable to agree on anything else, seemed swayed. Their indecision was maddening. "I disagree," came the voice of Ambassador Lyra, a small but fierce representative from the Eston Collective. "The risks of using such a weapon are too great. We risk annihilating entire civilizations." "And what do you propose, Ambassador?" Yaltarn's voice was low, filled with contempt. "We sit idly by as the pulse expands, while our people die." "We focus on diplomacy," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "We seek a peaceful solution. We find a way to contain the pulse without using a weapon of mass destruction." Rook's eyes narrowed. The pulse wasn't a matter of peace anymore, it was a ticking time bomb. Diplomacy was a luxury that had long since run out. He had seen too much, lost too much, to sit idly by while the Council quarreled over which method would be least destructive. Humanity had never been a species to wait for others to solve their problems, and now was not the time for debate. He rose from his seat, his movements sharp, decisive. The murmur of voices in the chamber slowly died as all eyes turned to him. The weight of his reputation preceded him. Rook was known for his skill as both a diplomat and a warrior, and he had earned the respect of the galaxy's most powerful beings, but even his presence could not change the stagnant air of indecision that had gripped the Council. "Enough." His voice was low but carried across the room. The calm before a storm. Yaltarn's eyes flashed with irritation, but Rook didn't care. His words were aimed at something far bigger than petty arguments. "This is pointless. This Council has wasted precious time debating while the pulse spreads. You want solutions, but you're too afraid to act. Well, I'm done waiting." The Council gasped as Rook turned sharply on his heel. The weight of his decision hung heavy in the room. "What are you doing?" Ambassador Lyra's voice broke through the silence, but Rook didn't answer. He simply walked toward the exit, his boots echoing with purpose on the stone floor. The doors opened before him as he reached them, and he stepped through, leaving the stunned assembly behind. The room erupted in chaos. Voices rose in anger, confusion, and disbelief. Rook's defiance sent shockwaves through the Council, and panic rippled across the galaxy. How could a human commander, someone who had been sent as a representative of peace, walk away from the table? But Rook was already moving. Outside the Council chamber, his mind raced. This wasn't just a failure of diplomacy, it was a failure of leadership. The Council's endless bickering and cowardice had placed the entire galaxy at risk, and the Vokari superweapon was a dangerous proposition that could ignite an all-out war. Humanity couldn't afford that. Rook couldn't afford that. He reached a secure communications room and activated his personal comms, sending a coded message to the United Terran Federation's military command. The message was simple: initiate Plan Valkyrie. Plan Valkyrie had been humanity's contingency plan for years, developed in secrecy by the brightest minds in the UTF. It was a solution to the pulse, a solution that didn't involve relying on the fragile politics of the Galactic Council. It was a military solution, one that didn't ask for permission, didn't beg for approval. It would stop the pulse, even if it meant taking the fight directly to the source. Rook was no longer just a diplomat. He was now a soldier on a mission. And the galaxy had just learned that humanity was not to be underestimated. The decision had been made. There was no going back. As Rook left the council building, the magnitude of his actions began to settle in. The council's factions were already mobilizing. A fleet would be dispatched to bring him back, to force him to comply with their will. But Rook wasn't worried. He had made his choice, and humanity's future depended on it. The next few days were a blur of activity. He worked alongside his most trusted officers to prepare for what was to come. His fleet, still in its infancy, was a ragtag group of human ships, sleek and maneuverable, but small compared to the massive warships of the alien factions. But it didn't matter. Rook had fought in wars before. He knew the power of strategy, of misdirection. Humanity had always been the underdog in every battle, but that had never stopped them from fighting. He stood in the command center of his flagship, the UNS Fury, watching as his officers worked tirelessly, preparing for the imminent confrontation. His second-in-command, Captain Marcus Coyle, approached, his face grim. "We've got trouble, sir," Coyle said, looking over his shoulder at the screens displaying the movements of alien fleets. "The Council's sending a fleet after us." Rook nodded, a cold smile creeping onto his face. "Let them come. They'll regret underestimating humanity." The fleet of alien ships was powerful, and they weren't alone. They were being joined by mercenaries from every corner of the galaxy, each one eager for a payday. But Rook had something they didn't. He had humanity's resolve, and that was a weapon that no alien could ever truly comprehend. "We'll fight them on our terms," Rook said, voice steady, yet filled with an unshakable certainty. "And when we win, we'll send a message to every corner of the galaxy." The tension in the air was palpable. This was no longer a diplomatic mission, it was a war. A war that Rook had just begun, and one that humanity would not lose. The first shots were fired as Rook's fleet jumped into hyperspace, heading toward the heart of the pulse. The war had begun. Commander Kane Rook stood at the helm of the UNS Fury, his eyes scanning the star-filled expanse of space. His fleet was small, a fraction of the size of the Council's war machines, but it didn't matter. What he lacked in numbers, he would make up for with strategy, speed, and unyielding resolve. The decision to break away from the Galactic Council was one Rook knew would change everything, but he had no time for second-guessing. Humanity's survival hung in the balance. "We've initiated evasive maneuvers, sir," Captain Marcus Coyle's voice broke through the tense silence. "The enemy fleet is closing in. They've already begun their chase." "Let them come," Rook replied, his voice cold, but filled with determination. "We're not running. We're leading them straight to the heart of the pulse." Rook turned toward the tactical display in the command center. The enemy fleet, a mix of alien warships and mercenary vessels, was closing in fast. These ships were massive, each one bristling with weapons and shields that far outclassed Rook's fleet. But what they didn't have was unity, something Rook knew humanity excelled at. His fleet was not just a collection of ships, it was a brotherhood forged in the fires of war, each crew member ready to lay down their life for the mission. The pulse. It was expanding, devouring everything in its path. For weeks, Rook and his team had studied it, an energy anomaly, a catastrophe that had already wiped out entire systems. No one knew what caused it, but everyone knew it had to be stopped. The Council had offered nothing but debate and empty promises. Now, Rook had taken matters into his own hands. The human-designed weapon, Plan Valkyrie, was the only hope left. "Time to move," Rook muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His crew had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now the time had come to execute their plan. The UNS Fury shot forward, its sleek form slicing through the void of space. Behind it, a half-dozen smaller ships followed, each one a testament to humanity's engineering prowess. The fleet was fast, nimble, and deadly. Their strategy was simple: stay out of the enemy's range and strike when the time was right. They would draw the enemy into the depths of the pulse, where even their overwhelming firepower wouldn't save them. But as they sped toward the anomaly, Rook couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The enemy fleet was too eager, too focused. The mercenaries, known for their unpredictability, were too willing to risk everything. It didn't make sense. Something wasn't right. "Captain," Rook said, his voice sharp. "Are the enemy ships moving according to their expected trajectories?" Coyle glanced at the tactical display, his eyes narrowing. "They're shifting, sir. They're not following the predicted intercept course. They're adapting. Fast." "That's impossible," Rook muttered. "No one adapts that quickly, not even them." "Unless," Coyle hesitated. "Unless someone's calling the shots from within our fleet." The realization hit Rook like a physical blow. A traitor. One of their own was working with the enemy. "Alert the crew." "We've got a leak," Rook snapped, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Lock down all communications. No one talks to anyone outside the fleet without my approval." Rook turned to face his second-in-command. "Coyle, I want every officer scrutinized. There's a rat among us, and I don't care how deep it runs. We can't afford to let them sabotage us now." The atmosphere in the command center shifted, the urgency rising. Rook could feel the weight of every decision bearing down on him. A traitor among them, and they were still heading straight into enemy fire. The only thing keeping them together now was his unwavering determination. He would not let humanity fall. "Sir," Coyle spoke again, his voice laced with tension. "We've intercepted a transmission. It's encrypted, but we've managed to decode part of it. It's from inside our fleet." The transmission crackled to life on the main screen, and Rook's heart sank. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. "Rook, you fool. You think you can save the galaxy with your pathetic little fleet?" It was Lieutenant Nora Keller, one of his most trusted officers. "You've doomed us all. You think you can fight the entire galaxy and win? You're out of your depth. The pulse isn't your enemy, it's ours to control. And you're walking straight into our trap." The transmission cut off abruptly, and Rook's blood ran cold. Keller. A traitor. The woman he had trusted, the one he had fought beside, had turned against him. "Set course for the pulse," Rook ordered, his voice clipped. "We're not turning back now. We'll deal with the traitor later." The crew, shaken but resolute, continued their work. Rook knew the stakes had changed. Now, not only was the pulse a threat, but there was someone on the inside working against them. The mission had become even more dangerous, but Rook wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. Not when humanity's future was at risk. They were close now, close enough that Rook could see the faint shimmer of the pulse in the distance. The energy anomaly pulsed with an eerie, destructive rhythm, its force strong enough to shatter the stars around it. It was a ticking bomb, and Rook was headed straight for its heart. "Enemy ships in range, sir," Coyle called out, his voice strained. "They're moving in fast. This is going to get ugly." "Prepare for battle," Rook commanded, his tone steady, unwavering. "Activate all weapons. We don't need to win this fight, we just need to survive long enough to finish the mission." The moment the words left his mouth, the enemy fleet descended upon them, weapons blazing. The first salvo hit the Fury's shields, shaking the ship with an intensity that rattled everyone on board. Rook braced himself, holding onto the command chair as the ship rocked violently. "Return fire." Rook barked. "I want them scattered." The UNS Fury fired back with everything it had. Missiles streaked through the vacuum of space, striking enemy vessels and sending explosions rippling through the darkness. The smaller ships in Rook's fleet followed suit, dodging enemy fire and retaliating with precision strikes. "Commander, we've got incoming!" Coyle shouted. "The enemy's launching a full barrage." Rook's mind raced as the chaos unfolded around him. Every instinct told him to retreat, to fight another day, but he knew that was not an option. They had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the pulse and finish what they'd started. "Brace for impact," Rook ordered, his voice loud enough to cut through the chaos. The ship's shields flared as they absorbed the full brunt of the enemy's attack. The UNS Fury shuddered again, but it held. "Keep pushing forward," Rook said, his voice grim but resolute. "We're not backing down. We're taking the fight to them. We've come this far, we're not going to let them stop us now." And so, with every passing second, the battle raged on. Humanity was being tested, pushed to its limits. Rook could feel the weight of every choice pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. There was only forward, into the heart of the pulse. The UNS Fury shuddered violently as another barrage hit its shields, the lights flickering in the command center. Rook's grip tightened on the armrests of his seat, his knuckles white, but his resolve unbroken. The enemy had launched their full assault, and their overwhelming numbers pressed in from all sides. His fleet was being crushed under the weight of the onslaught, but there was no room for retreat. No time to falter. The pulse loomed ahead, an ever-present reminder that every second spent fighting was a second closer to the annihilation of everything. "Status report," Rook shouted. "Shields holding at 62%, Commander," Coyle replied, his voice strained but steady. "Hull integrity holding as well, but we can't take much more of this. Our small ships are starting to get overwhelmed. They're getting picked off one by one." Rook's mind raced. He had anticipated the fight, he had known the Council's forces would come after him, but this was more than he had expected. The mercenaries were relentless, and their firepower was devastating. His fleet was small, but it was supposed to be fast and nimble. He had expected to draw the enemy into a trap, but now it seemed as though they were the ones walking into the trap. "Retreat's not an option," Rook muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. "If we fall back, we're done. Humanity is done." His thoughts were interrupted as the comm system crackled to life. It was an encrypted transmission, but Rook recognized the voice immediately, Lieutenant Nora Keller. "Rook, you stubborn fool," her voice was laced with venom. "You think you're going to save the galaxy with your little rebellion? You're leading your people to their deaths. The pulse isn't a weapon, it's the future. Only by embracing its power can we reshape this broken galaxy. You've no idea what you're fighting, do you?" The transmission cut off abruptly, and Rook's blood ran cold. Keller's betrayal was more than just an act of defiance, it was a calculated move to destroy everything they had fought for. Rook clenched his fists, fighting the fury that surged through him. The traitor had been lying in wait, biding her time, and now she had turned the tide against them. "She's using us as bait," Coyle said, his voice filled with realization. "She's leading the Council forces straight to the heart of the pulse. She wants us to die, Commander." "Not if I can help it," Rook replied, his voice cold, unwavering. "The mission is still on. We're going to finish what we started." He turned to the tactical screen and studied the layout of the enemy forces. The pulse was close, too close. They were running out of time. Every moment spent fighting was another moment the anomaly grew stronger. He had to act. Now. "All ships, follow my lead," Rook commanded, his voice carrying through the comms. "Prepare to make the jump to hyperspace. We'll cut through the enemy lines and breach the pulse's outer perimeter. We won't give them the chance to stop us." The fleet responded with grim determination. The UNS Fury began to move, its engines firing up with a burst of power. The smaller ships in Rook's fleet fell in line, following his every move as they cut through the heart of the enemy's assault. The barrage intensified, but the Fury's agility allowed it to weave through the incoming fire, its shields absorbing most of the damage. The other ships were not so lucky. Explosions rocked the void around them, sending debris flying in all directions. "Commander, we're losing ships." Coyle shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of the situation. If we don't get to the pulse soon, we'll be wiped out before we even have a chance. Rook's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of the decision in his gut. Every moment that passed felt like a countdown. There was no time for hesitation. He had already made his choice, and it was a choice that could cost him everything. Stay focused, Coyle, Rook said, his voice sharp. We've come too far to fail now. Prepare to breach the pulse's perimeter on my mark. The UNS Fury shot forward, its engines roaring as it raced toward the anomaly. The fleet followed, cutting through the enemy lines with precision. For a moment, it seemed like they might actually make it. But just as they neared the pulse's outer boundary, a massive explosion shook the Fury, throwing Rook off his feet. Report. Rook growled, struggling to regain his balance. Sir, we've been hit. Direct hit to the aft section. Coyle shouted, his face grim. Hull breach in multiple areas. Shields are down to 15%. We won't survive another hit like that. Rook gritted his teeth. He could feel the pressure mounting. They were so close, too close to turn back. The pulse was within their grasp, and yet the enemy was pushing harder than ever, forcing them into a desperate fight for survival. Stay on course. Rook commanded, his voice unwavering. We're almost there. The pulse is our only hope now. The UNS Fury surged forward, the gap between them and the anomaly narrowing by the second. But the enemy forces weren't giving up. The remaining ships of the Council fleet had closed in, and they launched another barrage, this one more powerful than the last. Rook's heart skipped a beat as the Fury was rocked again, the ship groaning under the pressure. We're not going to make it, Commander. Coyle yelled. We need to break off. Rook's gaze remained fixed on the tactical display. The pulse was so close now, its terrifying power pulsing with the rhythm of the universe. There was no other option. They had to breach it, or they would die trying. I said, stay on course. Rook roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. We're human, God damn it. We don't run from the fight, we make our own fate. With one final push, the UNS Fury blasted through the last line of enemy ships, its engines roaring as it tore into the heart of the pulse. The ship's hull shuddered, the walls rattling with the intensity of the anomaly's energy. Rook's grip tightened on the controls as he guided the ship into the storm. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything went dark. A blinding flash of light engulfed the ship, and for a split second, Rook felt weightless. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light vanished, and everything returned to a nightmarish calm. Report. Rook barked, struggling to steady himself. Commander, Coyle's voice was weak, filled with disbelief. We made it. We're inside the pulse. But, we're not alone. Rook looked up, his eyes narrowing as a new force came into view. Dozens of ships, heavily damaged but still functional, were drifting in the midst of the anomaly. And at their center, the UNS Fury was surrounded by a fleet that had no business being here, human ships. Rook's own ships. But they weren't under his control anymore. Impossible, Rook muttered, a chill running down his spine. They've been here longer than us. But how? A single, unmistakable voice crackled through the comms, echoing in Rook's ears. Rook, Keller's voice was low, filled with malice. You should have listened. Humanity is ours to control now. Welcome to the future. Rook's blood ran cold. The true enemy was not the pulse, not the Council, but the very humans he had fought to save. Prepare to fight, Rook growled, his voice cold as ice. We're not dying here, not today. Rook's grip on the control panel tightened as he watched the enemy ships surround him. The UNS Fury groaned under the pressure, its hull buckling slightly as the strange gravity of the pulse toyed with its structure. He stared at the communication screen, his face hard as Keller's image flickered to life. Her eyes gleamed with the quiet arrogance of someone who thought they had already won. You really thought you could fight the entire galaxy and come out on top? Keller's voice was ice cold, every word dripping with contempt. The pulse was always meant to change things, Rook. It's not just a weapon, it's evolution. And you, well, you were too weak to understand. Rook's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. There was no going back now. Humanity had reached a crossroads. The old guard, the council, had already proven it was too compromised, too feeble to handle the storm that was coming. But Keller had been part of his team, part of the mission. The betrayal stung in ways he hadn't anticipated. Enough with your monologues, Keller, Rook growled, his voice low but fierce. You've already destroyed enough. If you think you can control humanity with this insanity, you're wrong. Keller's eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a thin smile. You really don't get it, do you? Humanity has always been chaos, untamed, unpredictable. But I've harnessed that chaos. I've turned it into something greater than you can comprehend. Rook's mind raced. He had underestimated her. This wasn't just about a betrayal, it was about an ideological war. The pulse wasn't a means of survival. It was a weapon to reshape the galaxy in Keller's image. She had been laying the groundwork for this moment, using his own tactics against him, manipulating the very chaos she had once fought alongside. You can't control the galaxy with fear, Keller, Rook said, his voice hardening. You can't bend it to your will. The galaxy has a way of fighting back, and we, humans, are the proof of that. Her smile widened, but there was a darkness in her eyes now. That's where you're wrong, Rook. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and you're too late. We're already beyond the point of no return. The pulse is ours now. Rook's mind snapped into focus. The pulse had been humanity's greatest challenge, but it was also its greatest opportunity. Keller and the Council had been blind to what the pulse could truly be, a symbol of humanity's resilience, not a tool of destruction. Humanity was not meant to bow to anyone. It was meant to stand tall. He could see the future in his mind's eye, a future where they fought not just for survival, but for their place in the universe. The comms crackled again. This time, it wasn't Keller. It was Coyle. Commander, we're getting incoming fire from all sides. The pulse, it's shifting. Something's not right. Rook's eyes darted to the tactical screen. The anomaly was changing. It wasn't just the environment inside the pulse, it was the anomaly itself. It was as if it was alive, reacting to their presence, feeding off the conflict. What's happening, Coyle? Rook barked. I'm not sure, Coyle responded, urgency in his voice. It's like it's evolving. The energy signatures are fluctuating. It's amplifying in ways we can't predict. Rook turned back to the screen, his eyes narrowing. He could feel the pull of the pulse intensifying. The atmosphere inside the anomaly was thick with the weight of impending doom. But it was also pulsing with energy, an energy that could be harnessed, if they were smart enough to survive. Keller, Rook said through clenched teeth. You may have thought you controlled the pulse, but you've made one critical mistake. You never understood the human spirit. You never understood what we can do when pushed to the brink. She laughed. It was the same mocking laugh, but it had a tremor of doubt now. Do you honestly think you can stop this? We're beyond you, Rook. You're out of time. Rook didn't answer. He had no time for her rhetoric. His fingers danced across the control panel, activating the ship's emergency systems. The Fury shuddered again, its systems on the verge of failing, but it wasn't the Fury he was focused on. It was the pulse. If he could access the anomaly's core, he could manipulate its energy, turning it against Keller's forces. He had no choice but to take the risk. All hands, brace for impact, Rook commanded. We're going in. The Fury surged forward, its engines roaring as it tore through the heart of the pulse. The battle outside was raging, but it was now secondary. The pulse was their battlefield. The pulse was their weapon. Commander, the energy levels are off the charts. Coyle shouted, his voice almost drowned out by the alarms. We can't stay in here much longer. If we don't get out. We won't, Rook interrupted. We're not getting out. We're ending this now. He slammed his fist into the control panel, sending a surge of power into the ship's core systems. The Fury's engines flared brightly as it pushed deeper into the heart of the pulse. The ship's hull groaned in protest, but Rook held firm. The anomaly was reacting to them, pulling at the ship, but Rook had already anticipated this. The pulse wasn't just a force of nature. It was a challenge. And if anyone could overcome it, it was humanity. "Commander," Coyle's voice came again, this time filled with fear. "We've done it. The pulse, it's destabilizing. We're..." "Focus, Coyle." Rook snapped. "We're still in this fight." The pulse quivered violently as the Fury passed through its center, and then something changed. The very fabric of the anomaly began to tear at the seams. It was as if the pulse was dying, unraveling in real time. But Keller wasn't done yet. She had been lying in wait. The comms flared again, and her voice cut through the chaos. "You've made a mistake, Rook. This is where it ends." Before Rook could respond, the ship's systems went dark. The screens blinked out, and a sudden vacuum of silence filled the command deck. Then, a bright, blinding light flooded the room, and Rook felt it, like a punch to the gut. "All hands!" Rook shouted, his voice filled with authority despite the growing pressure. "Hold on!" A massive shockwave hit the Fury, shaking it to its core. The control panel shattered, sending sparks flying. Rook gritted his teeth and held onto the console, his entire body bracing against the force. Then, all at once, the ship lurched violently as it was thrown out of the heart of the pulse. And then, nothing. The silence was deafening. Rook's eyes flickered open. He was no longer inside the pulse. The Fury had been ejected from the core, barely holding together. The control systems were down. The ship was on the verge of collapse. Coyle's voice broke through the silence. "Commander, it's over. We're out." Rook stood tall despite the damage. His mind was racing, but there was a grim satisfaction. They had survived. They had won. But the victory felt hollow. The pulse had been contained, but it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Prepare for the next battle," Rook said, his voice hard. "Humanity won't be pushed aside again. This is just the beginning." The comms crackled again, and Keller's voice came through one last time. "You think you've won, Rook? You haven't seen the last of me. We'll meet again." Rook didn't respond. He didn't need to. The galaxy had been changed forever. Humanity had proven something important, something Keller and the rest of the galaxy had failed to understand. They didn't wait for permission. They didn't ask for a seat at the table. They took what was theirs. And in the end, it would be their legacy, one of defiance, strength, and an unwavering will to survive.